by 3 weeks of
A
surveillance.
prop player handles hundreds of chips per stage, and a team between guys and ambers from Moscow.
750.
Every move Ellen Mangunddao made at that card table for 3 straight weeks was being recorded. She is seconds away from finding out that Casino M8 Tricks, the SJPD Financial Crimes Unit, and the Division of Gaming Control watched every single one.
Chips on your person right now. 75,000 cash and 10,000 of chips recovered from your homes tonight.
I want to speak with an attorney before I say anything else about any of this.
Several years, hundreds of thousands of dollars in casino chips. One contracted third-party proposition player working the floor at a San Jose card room. One husband who walked up to the cage as an ordinary patron and redeemed the chips she had quietly passed him during her shift. By the time San Jose police closed the surveillance window on the woman in this footage, investigators would have $75,000 in cash and nearly $15,000 in casino chips stacked on an evidence table, and a 3-week reel of footage that explained how it had all worked. Before we go any further, what would you do if you found out the person sitting next to you at a card table was running a years-long scheme against the house? Drop a comment with your honest answer, and if you're new here, subscribe. We cover the cases other channels won't touch. Ellen Mangunddao was born in San Jose, California, in the spring of 1987. Her parents had immigrated from the Philippines a decade earlier and had built the kind of working-class American life that defined Filipino-American San Jose at that time. A small house on the east side, 2 jobs between them, 3 kids, a strict household, and a Sunday tradition of long, noisy meals at her grandmother's apartment in Berryessa. Her father worked nights at a warehouse off Junction Avenue. Her mother was a certified nursing assistant at a long-term care facility off Story Road, a job she would hold for 31 years before retiring. Ellen was the middle child. Her older brother went into HVAC out of high school. Her younger sister became a dental hygienist. Ellen, the one with the head for numbers, the one who could count cards in a deck before she was 10, was supposed to be the one who went to college. She did go to college. 2 years at San Jose City College, an associate's degree in business administration, decent grades. She transferred to San Jose State with the intention of finishing a bachelor's in accounting. She made it 3 semesters before the money ran out. Her father had been laid off from the warehouse. Her mother's hours had been cut. Ellen withdrew in good standing, told her parents she would re-enroll the next year, and went looking for full-time work. She found it in the place a lot of San Jose kids with a head for numbers find it. In 2008, when she was 21 years old, Ellen Mangunddao walked into a card room on the north end of the city and asked about openings. She was hired the same week, not by the card room itself, but by a third-party vendor that supplied proposition players to several San Jose card rooms under contract with the houses. She took a 2-week training course on California card room rules, on Pai Gow poker, on baccarat, on the structural mechanics of player-banked games. She passed her background check. She got her gaming registration with the California Bureau of Gambling Control. She was, on paper, a contracted player, not a casino employee, not a dealer, not a pit worker, a licensed contractor who sat at the table and served as the player bank for whatever game the house was running. Mark Mangunddao was already in her life by the time she started. He was 3 years older, born in 1984, Filipino-American, from the same East Side neighborhood. They had known each other since high school, drifted apart during community college, and started dating again when Ellen was 20. He worked in auto parts inventory at a wholesale supplier off Monterey Road. He drove a 2003 Toyota Tacoma he had bought used and kept meticulously clean. He was quiet in a way that her family approved of and steady in a way that her father respected. They married in 2010 at Holy Spirit Parish in San Jose. The reception was at the Filipino Community Center on Northrop Street. 240 guests. Ellen wore her mother's veil. They danced to a Lea Salonga song for the first dance, then to Bruno Mars for the second. Her father gave a toast in Tagalog that none of Mark's cousins understood, but everyone clapped for. They put the wedding cash toward a down payment on a small house in the Cambrian neighborhood. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a garage Mark had already started converting into a workshop in his head. The next decade looked like a decent life. Ellen kept her contracted player job. Mark stayed at the auto parts supplier, then transferred to a larger distributor in Milpitas with better hours. They had 2 kids, a boy in 2012, a girl in 2015. Ellen worked the swing shift at the card room 4 nights a week. Mark worked days. The kids were raised by Ellen's mother in the afternoons and by Ellen in the mornings and on weekends. Family birthdays at the Cambrian house. School pictures pinned to the refrigerator. A 2014 Honda Pilot in the driveway next to the Tacoma. 2 weeks of vacation a year, usually Lake Tahoe in the summer, sometimes a trip back to the Philippines for Ellen's grandmother's birthday in February. By 2018, Ellen had been a contracted third-party proposition player for 10 years. She had a reputation among the floor supervisors at the rooms she worked. She was reliable. She showed up on time. She didn't drink on shift. She kept clean records. Her vendor used her on the busier games, the higher-action Pai Gow tables, the baccarat games where the player banking function required somebody who understood the math and didn't panic when the house caught a run. Her supervisor reviews, the ones the third-party vendor kept on file, described her in the language that any contractor in any industry would recognize. Detail-oriented, consistent, understands the rotation. She knew the work. She knew the math. She knew the house. And by the time the casino on Highway 101 started running surveillance on the table she sat at most nights, she had been doing the work, by the police department's later allegation, long enough to have moved hundreds of thousands of dollars in chips through a scheme that had, until that May, never tripped a single alarm. To understand what Ellen Mangunddao was alleged to have done, you have to understand a structural feature of California gaming law that does not exist in Nevada, and that most people who have only ever played at a Vegas casino have never thought about. In Nevada, the house banks the games. The casino takes the bets, the casino pays the winners, the casino keeps the losses, and the dealer at the table is a casino employee handling casino chips on behalf of the casino. The chips themselves never leave the casino's accounting structure. Every chip on the table belongs to the house until it goes into a player's stack, and every chip that goes into a player's stack is tracked by the cage when it comes back for redemption. In California, it works differently. California card rooms, also called card rooms, also called card clubs, are not allowed to bank the games themselves. State law prohibits it. The structural workaround the state developed decades ago is called the player banking model. Under the player banking model, the players at the table take turns acting as the bank for the game, covering bets, paying winners, collecting losses, while the card room takes a flat fee per hand, or per rotation for hosting the game. The problem the card rooms ran into, almost immediately, is that ordinary recreational players don't want to bank the game. Banking the game requires sitting in the bank position with enough capital to cover every possible payout at the table. Most weekend players don't carry that kind of bankroll and don't want the exposure. So the state authorized a second category of contractor, the third-party proposition player. A third-party proposition player is a contractor, not a casino employee, not a dealer, not a state employee. They are licensed by the California Bureau of Gambling Control. They are employed by a private vendor company that has a contract with the card room. The vendor pays them. The card room pays the vendor. The third-party player sits at the table during games like Pai Gow Poker, Baccarat, or various proprietary house-banked equivalent games, and serves as the bank for the players who don't want to bank the game themselves. They handle casino chips. They cover the bets. They pay out the winners and collect from the losers. They are, in the structural sense of the word, indistinguishable at the table from any other player, except that they are there as a paid contractor and they are sitting in the bank seat. This is the architecture Ellen Mangunddao worked inside for 17 years. The oversight architecture that surrounds the third-party player is layered, but it has a particular shape. The card room's surveillance department watches the floor and the table. The card room's chip control department reconciles the chip inventory at the start and end of each shift. The card room's cage manages chip redemptions for any patron walking up to cash out. The third-party vendor manages the players themselves, their scheduling, their pay, their conduct. And the California Bureau of Gambling Control sits above all of it as the state regulator. The gap in the architecture, the one the SJPD Division of Gaming Control would later have to walk a jury through, is the gap between the third-party player on the floor and the unrelated patron at the cage. The cage doesn't know which chips came off which table at which moment. The cage doesn't know which patron is related to which contracted player. The cage processes redemptions. A man walks up with a stack of chips. The cage counts them. The cage pays out. The man walks away. Casino M8 Tricks, the card room located near Highway 101 in San Jose, runs surveillance and chip controls. So does every licensed card room in California. But the oversight model assumes that the patron redeeming chips at the cage is unrelated to the contracted player who handled those chips on the floor. When that assumption fails, when the patron at the cage is the husband of the contracted player on the floor, the architecture has no built-in mechanism to catch the connection. The chips look like winnings. The redemption looks like a normal patron cashing out, and the contracted player at the table looks like she's doing her job. That was the gap. That was the architecture. That was what was alleged to have been quietly exploited, shift after shift, for years. According to the San Jose Police Department's allegations and the chronology established by Casino M8 Tricks' internal surveillance, the operational pattern that emerged during the May 1st to May 22nd, 2025 observation window had a specific shape. Ellen Mangunddao worked the swing shift. She would arrive at the card room in the late afternoon, clock in through her vendor's tablet, and report to whichever Pai Gow or Baccarat table the floor supervisor placed her on for the night. She sat in the bank position. The cards came out. The players placed their bets. Ellen, as the player bank, covered the bets, paid winners, collected from losers, and moved chips back and forth in the structural rhythm of the game. The chips she handled during gameplay were a mix. Some belonged to the third-party vendor's bankroll, the working capital the vendor put on the table to allow Ellen to bank the games. Some flowed in from losing players and out to winning players in the normal course of play. The chip tracking architecture inside the card room, the inventory at the start of the shift, the count at the end of the shift, the reconciliation between the chip rack and the vendor's bankroll, operated at the level of aggregate totals, not at the level of individual chip-by-chip accounting. The alleged scheme, the one investigators would later reconstruct from the May 1st to May 22nd surveillance window, exploited the gap between aggregate reconciliation and individual chip movement. Per the police allegations, Ellen would, in the course of a normal shift, palm or set aside individual chips during the rhythm of gameplay. The amounts per session were small enough that no single hand looked wrong. A red chip here, a green chip there, a black chip on a busier night. Spread across an 8-hour shift, across 30 or 40 hands per hour, the totals could move into the hundreds of dollars without ever creating a single moment that surveillance would flag in isolation. The chips would not leave the table during her shift. She would, per the allegations, transfer them at a specific point in the rotation, during a break, during a shift change, in the parking lot after she clocked out, to her husband. Mark Mangunddao was the second half of the architecture. He would arrive at the card room as an ordinary patron. He would play at the lower stakes tables for an hour, sometimes two, the way any recreational gambler might. He would mix the chips Ellen had given him with chips from his own play. Then he would walk to the cage, set the stack on the counter, and ask to cash out. The cage staff didn't know him. The cage staff didn't know that the woman across the floor at the Pai Gow table was his wife. The cage processed the redemption. A few $100s one night, several hundred another. Sometimes, on the nights when the chips had accumulated across multiple shifts, over 1,000, Mark would sign for the cash. He would put the cash in his pocket. He would walk out. The police would later allege that this pattern had run, in some form, for several years. The casino's surveillance, once it was reviewed with the benefit of knowing what to look for, would document the architecture in detail across the 3-week May 2025 window. Ellen at the table, Mark in the room, the chip transfers in the periphery, the cage redemptions an hour or two later, the cycle repeating, shift after shift, week after week. The signs that should have been visible in retrospect, the patterns that any forensic analyst would have flagged if they had been looking, were the kind of small structural anomalies that don't announce themselves. Slight, persistent shortages in the third-party vendor's bankroll reconciliation. A patron, Mark, who appeared at the card room on a schedule that correlated, when overlaid, with Ellen's shift schedule. Chip redemption totals at the cage from this one patron that, when aggregated across months, did not match a credible win-loss profile for the games he was observed playing. None of it was visible from inside any one department. The vendor saw the bankroll. The cage saw the redemptions. Surveillance saw the floor. Chip control saw the inventory. No one was looking at all 4 data streams at once. No one was looking at the relationship network risk between a contracted player on the floor and a recreational patron at the cage. The Mangunddaos kept ordinary lives across the same years the alleged scheme ran. The kids' birthday parties at the Cambrian house. School pickup at the elementary school off Camden Avenue. Mark's hours at the Milpitas distributor. Ellen's vendor pay stubs deposited into the joint checking. A second car payment, a 2019 Honda Odyssey, that the family budget could plausibly support on the combined declared income. The cash, per the later search warrant returns, did not go into the bank. $75,000 of it was, when investigators searched the 2 associated residences on May 30th, 2025, still on the premises. Stored in places that the search warrant inventory would itemize and that the eventual prosecution would describe in court. Not invested, not laundered through a business, not moved offshore, just held. That detail, the cash on hand rather than the cash converted, would later say something about the architecture of the scheme. The Mangunddaos had not built a money laundering operation. They had built, allegedly, a chip redemption pipeline. The cash that came out the other end of the pipeline was not, in the operational sense, finished. It was the raw output. What they planned to do with it, over time, was a question the case file would not necessarily answer. What they did do was hold it. And what the casino did, on the morning of May 23, 2025, was pick up the phone and call the San Jose Police Department. The catalyst was the casino itself. Casino M8trix's chip tracking architecture had, at some point in the spring of 2025, generated a discrepancy that the card room's internal compliance team could not reconcile to normal play variance. The available reporting does not disclose the exact nature of the trigger, whether it was an aggregate shortage in the third-party vendor's bankroll, an audit flag from the cage's monthly reconciliation, a tip from a floor supervisor who had noticed Mark at the cage one too many times, or a software-driven anomaly in the card room's chip control system. What is documented in the SJPD release is that on May 23, 2025, the casino notified the San Jose Police Department of a suspected embezzlement scheme involving a contracted third-party player and a patron believed to be cashing chips on her behalf. The SJPD Financial Crimes Unit took the report, the case was assigned, and the San Jose Police Department's Division of Gaming Control, the specialized unit responsible for oversight of San Jose's card room industry, was brought in to assist. The Division of Gaming Control matters here. Most municipal police departments do not have specialized gaming units. San Jose does because San Jose has card rooms, Casino M8trix and Bay 101, both major operations near Highway 101 in the southern half of the city. And because card room oversight in California is a layered responsibility between the State Bureau of Gambling Control, the local jurisdiction, and the card room's own internal compliance. The SJPD Division of Gaming Control is the unit inside the San Jose Police Department that understands the player banking model, the third-party proposition player architecture, the chip control protocols, and the cage redemption mechanics from the inside. It was the Division of Gaming Control that walked the Financial Crimes Unit through what to look for. The investigators did not start with the Mangunddaos. They started with the architecture. They asked the casino for the chip control reconciliation reports for the preceding months. They asked for the cage redemption logs filtered by patron. They asked for the third-party vendor's schedule for the relevant tables. They asked for surveillance footage covering the bank positions and the cage windows during specific shifts. What the data showed, when it was layered, was the structural pattern that nothing inside any single department had been able to see. The chip redemption profile of one particular patron, Mark Mangunddao, identified through the cage's patron records, correlated with the shift schedule of one particular contracted player, Ellen Mangunddao, identified through the third-party vendor's records. The correlation was not occasional, it was systemic. Mark cashed chips at the cage on the nights Ellen worked the bank position. He cashed chips, in some weeks, on every single night Ellen worked. And the totals he cashed, when aggregated across the surveillance window the investigators eventually defined as May 1st through May 22nd, 2025, did not match the play profile that the card room surveillance had captured of him on the floor. That was the catalyst, not a single dramatic incident, not a confession, not an external whistleblower. The casino had identified the pattern, called the police, and handed over the data. And the SJPD had, once it had the data, identified the two people at the center of it. Between May 23rd and May 30th, 2025, SJPD's Financial Crimes Unit moved to the next phase. They built the affidavit. They documented the surveillance pattern. They tied the redemption records to the shift schedule. They obtained an arrest warrant for Ellen Mangunddao. They obtained an arrest warrant for Mark Mangunddao. And they obtained search warrants for 2 associated residences in San Jose. 7 days. From the casino's phone call to the morning the warrants were signed. The investigative architecture the SJPD Financial Crimes Unit built across that 7-day window, and across the additional weeks of post-arrest forensic work that would follow, rested on 5 evidentiary pillars that the eventual prosecution would have to walk a jury through. The first pillar was the casino's surveillance footage. Casino M8 Tricks, like every licensed California card room, maintains continuous surveillance over its gaming floor, its cage, and its perimeter. The footage from the May 1st to May 22nd, 2025 window, the 3-week observation period the investigators would eventually rely on, captured the architecture of the alleged scheme in granular detail. Ellen at the bank position, the hand-to-hand chip handling during play, the transfers, whatever form they took, that moved chips from her position to Mark's pocket. Mark at the cage. The redemptions logged and time-stamped. The second pillar was the casino's chip control records. The card room's chip inventory. The count at the start of each shift. The count at the end of each shift. The reconciliation against the third-party vendor's bankroll had produced the discrepancy pattern that had triggered the casino's report in the first place. Once the SJPD had a defined surveillance window, the chip control data could be cross-referenced against the surveillance footage and against the cage's redemption logs to produce a quantified loss figure for the prosecution's eventual filing. The third pillar was the cage's redemption logs. Every chip redemption at the card room's cage was recorded, patron identification where required, timestamp, amount, denomination breakdown. Mark Mangunddao's redemptions across the relevant period were itemized. Each transaction would, in the prosecution's later filings, be tied to a specific shift Ellen had worked and to a specific surveillance reel that had captured Mark on the floor that night. The fourth pillar was the physical recovery from the May 30 search warrant execution. When SJPD officers served the search warrants at the 2 associated residences in San Jose, they recovered more than $75,000 in U.S. currency and approximately $10,000 in additional casino chips from the homes. Combined with the $4,750 in chips recovered on Ellen Mangunddao at the time of her arrest, the total recovery at the moment of arrest was approximately $89,750. The cash and the chips were photographed, inventoried, and booked into the SJPD evidence locker. The fifth pillar was the institutional expertise of the SJPD Division of Gaming Control. The unit's investigators understood the third-party proposition player architecture in a way that a general financial crimes detective would have had to learn from scratch. They understood the structural separation between the card room and the third-party vendor. They understood the chip control protocols. They understood the cage redemption mechanics. They were able to translate the surveillance footage and the chip control data into a coherent, operational narrative that the affidavit could support and that the prosecution could eventually present. The historical scope, the hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years that the SJPD release would describe, was the harder question.
Have you ever wanted to see your home from space? With this free satellite Earth Maps tool, you can zoom right down to your exact...
The defined surveillance window was 3 weeks. The recovered cash and chips at the moment of arrest were approximately $90,000. The leap from a 3-week documented window to a multi-year historical allegation would, in any eventual prosecution, require investigators to extend the analysis backward, to pull cage redemption records going back years, to overlay them against Ellen's shift records going back years, to identify the same statistical pattern in the older data that the May 2025 surveillance had captured in real time. That work, as of the available reporting, was underway, but not yet a matter of public record. The arrest had been made on the strength of the 3-week window. The historical allegation was an allegation. The presumption of innocence applied, and would continue to apply, to both Ellen Mangunddao and Mark Mangunddao throughout the proceedings that followed. We're about to get to the morning of the arrests. Before we do, if you've made it this far, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Subscribe if you haven't. We cover the case's mainstream media skips, and the next part is the part that makes this case different from the standard cardroom embezzlement file. The morning of Friday, May 30th, 2025, began before sunrise for the San Jose Police Department officers assigned to the warrant service. The plan called for coordinated execution. The arrest warrant for Ellen Mangunddao. The arrest warrant for Mark Mangunddao. The search warrants for 2 associated residences in San Jose. The Financial Crimes Unit detectives. The Division of Gaming Control investigators. Uniformed support officers for perimeter security. Evidence technicians. A digital forensics specialist, the whole architecture of a financial crimes warrant operation, mobilized for a couple from the Cambrian neighborhood. Ellen Mangunddao was arrested on Friday, May 30th, 2025. The available reporting does not specify whether she was arrested at her home, at the card room, or at another location. What the reporting does document is that at the moment of her arrest, she was carrying $4,750 in casino chips on her person. The chips were itemized at booking: red chips, green chips, black chips. The denominations were recorded. The serial markings, where they existed, were logged against the card room's chip inventory. Mark Mangunddao was arrested the same morning. The reporting does not document the specific circumstances of his arrest, only that the warrants were served on May 30th, 2025, and that both Ellen and Mark were booked into the Santa Clara County Jail on suspicion of felony embezzlement and conspiracy. The search warrant execution at the 2 associated residences produced the rest of the recovery. SJPD evidence technicians worked through the homes room by room. They photographed the locations where the cash was stored. They photographed the locations where the chips were stored. They counted. They inventoried. They booked. By the end of the day, more than $75,000 in currency and approximately $10,000 in additional casino chips were in SJPD custody. The booking process at the Santa Clara County Jail took its own course. The intake forms, the fingerprints, the mugshots, the medical screening, the jail's standard processing for 2 suspects facing felony embezzlement and conspiracy charges under California state law. The Mangunddaos were processed and held. Whether Ellen Mangunddao asked for an attorney at the moment of arrest, whether she made any statement to investigators, whether she invoked her right to silence, none of this is documented in the available public reporting. What is documented is that by the end of the day, on May 30th, 2025, both Ellen and Mark Mangunddao were in custody. The evidence was in the SJPD evidence locker, and the case had moved out of the investigative phase and into the prosecutorial phase. The charges, as documented in the available reporting, were felony embezzlement and conspiracy under California state law. The specific penal code sections, the exact subsections of California's embezzlement statute, and the conspiracy statute that the district attorney's office would ultimately file under, were not disclosed in the SJPD release. The available reporting confirms only the categorical charges and the jail booking. In California, felony embezzlement carries a sentencing range that depends on the dollar amount alleged. For embezzlement over $950, the charge is filed as a felony. For embezzlement over the higher statutory thresholds, $65,000, $200,000, $1,300,000, $3,200,000, California Penal Code Section 122. 6 adds sentencing enhancements that scale with the loss amount. The hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years allegation by SJPD, if charged at the corresponding loss tier, would carry the enhancements that come with that tier. Conspiracy under California Penal Code Section 182 carries its own sentencing structure. When the conspiracy is to commit a felony, the conspiracy charge is itself a felony with sentencing tied to the underlying offense. The case, as of the available reporting, has not reached its disposition. The plea negotiations, the pretrial motions, the eventual trial, if there is a trial, and the sentencing phase, if there is a sentencing phase, are all part of the case file that has not yet become a matter of public record. What is on the record is the institutional question the case raised, the question the SJPD Division of Gaming Control and the California Bureau of Gambling Control would have to answer, in some form, in the months and years that followed. The third-party proposition player architecture is a structural feature of California cardroom gaming law. It exists because California card rooms cannot bank the games themselves and because ordinary patrons cannot reliably fill the bank position. The architecture solves a real problem. It also creates, as the Mangunddao case demonstrated, a specific oversight gap, the gap between the contracted player on the floor and the unrelated patron at the cage. The relationship network risk between contracted players and patrons is the institutional vulnerability the case exposed. Card rooms do not, as a matter of standard practice, cross-reference their cage redemption records against the relationship networks of their contracted players. The third-party vendor that employs the player does not, as a matter of standard practice, monitor the card room's cage activity for patrons connected to its employees. The State Bureau of Gambling Control does not, as a matter of standard practice, audit relationship networks across the licensed contractor population. The Mangunddao allegation, if the prosecution proves it, would suggest that the architecture's blind spot is exploitable for years before any single department's data catches the pattern. The casino's chip control system caught it eventually. The SJPD's Division of Gaming Control connected it to the contracted player on the floor. The investigators built the affidavit and served the warrants. But the years that the SJPD alleged the scheme had run before the casino noticed are the years the institutional architecture had not protected against. For the Mangunddaos themselves, the consequences are what the consequences of any felony embezzlement and conspiracy charge in California are. The criminal proceedings will move through the Santa Clara County Superior Court system. The plea negotiations or the trial will determine the disposition. If convicted, the sentencing range is determined by the loss tier and by the conspiracy enhancement. If acquitted, the case ends. The presumption of innocence applies until the prosecution proves the case beyond a reasonable doubt. What is already on the record, regardless of the eventual disposition, is the structural lesson. The California cardroom architecture has a known oversight gap. The relationship network risk between contracted third-party proposition players and the patrons who redeem chips at the cage is a real institutional vulnerability. Whether the response from the California Bureau of Gambling Control, from the SJPD Division of Gaming Control, from the third-party player vendor industry, or from the card rooms themselves, Whether that response addresses the gap or leaves it in place is the institutional question the Mangunddao case will be remembered for, long after the criminal file closes. The two associated residences in San Jose are quiet now. The Honda Pilot sits in the driveway of the Cambrian house. The kids' school pictures are still pinned to the refrigerator. The Toyota Tacoma. Mark drove for 2 decades, is parked behind the Pilot. The neighbors on the block know what happened, because the searches on the morning of May 30th, 2025 were not invisible. The neighborhood watch group on the social network app talked about it for a week. Then the conversation moved on. The casino on Highway 101 reopened the next shift after the warrant service and kept running. The third-party vendor reassigned the bank positions Ellen Mangunddao had been working. The cage staff who had cashed Mark Mangunddao's chips week after week for years kept cashing chips for whoever walked up to the window. The architecture that had let the alleged scheme run continued to run. That story was unsettling. But the case on the right-hand side is the kind that makes you wonder how anyone working inside a system this fragile ever gets caught at all. Click it now.